The conference room went silent in a way that made people forget how to breathe. Jennifer Whitmore stood at the head of the table, her hands flat against the polished wood, staring at a document she had just been handed by her own legal team. The words on the page weren't long. They didn't need to be. Patent holder, Marcus Callaway. Primary systems architect, Marcus Callaway. Controlling shareholder, Eastfield Industrial Holdings, Marcus Callaway. She looked up at the man sitting at the far end of the table, the same man she had laughed at 6 months ago when he walked into her facility carrying a worn tool bag and dirt under his fingernails. He wasn't laughing now. He wasn't doing much of anything except watching her with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who had already won this fight before it started. But to understand how a woman who ran a $240 million on manufacturing empire ended up losing everything to a man she called small, we need to go back, 6 months back, to a repair shop on the south side of Charlotte, North Carolina, and a single phone call that changed the trajectory of 2 lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Marcus Callaway was 47 years old the morning it all began. He ran a machine repair business out of a narrow brick building on Eastway Drive, the kind of place that looked like it had been there since the 1970s because it had. The paint on the exterior was faded gray. The hand-lettered sign above the door read Callaway Precision Repair in block letters that someone had touched up with a brush every few years but never fully repainted. Inside, the shop was different. Every tool hung in its exact place on pegboard walls outlined in marker, so nothing ever returned to the wrong spot. The floor was swept before the first job of the day, even when no jobs were scheduled. The workbenches were clear except for whatever Marcus was actively repairing, and in the corner of the main bench, sitting in a small patch of morning sunlight, was a stuffed bear named Atlas that belonged to Marcus's daughter, Amara. She was 10 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, and fiercely protective of that bear in the way only a 10-year-old can be. Marcus dropped her at his neighbor's house every morning at 7:42 and picked her up at 5:11. In between, he worked. What most people didn't know, because Marcus had never told them, and the information wasn't printed anywhere visible, was that he had spent 13 years before the shop as a lead systems engineer at Davenport Engineering Solutions, one of the more respected industrial automation firms on the East Coast. He had designed production line control systems for manufacturers in 9 states. He had filed 7 patents during those years, all under his own name per his contract, all related to precision automation and cascade failure prevention in high-volume manufacturing. 3 of those patents had been licensed to major manufacturers through Davenport's IP division, and the royalty payments that deposited into his account each quarter were modest but reliable. Marcus had left Davenport, not because the work dried up, not because he was pushed out, but because his wife, Camille, had died of breast cancer when Amara was 4 years old, and someone had to be home. He had made that choice with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. He did not grieve it publicly. He did not speak about his former career unless directly asked, and almost no one directly asked. His friend Raymond Cole, who had known him since their first semester at North Carolina A&T and now ran a private equity fund in Raleigh, asked about it regularly. Marcus's answer was always the same deflection, a slight turn of the head, a return to whatever was in his hands. Raymond understood that the conversation would happen when Marcus was ready for it to happen, and not before. The one thing that kept Marcus's name alive in industrial circles, without his name ever appearing, was his reputation for fixing what others couldn't. Word moved slowly in that world, from plant manager to plant manager, from maintenance supervisor to shift lead, and the word was simple. If a machine stopped working and no one else could bring it back, call the man at Callaway Precision. He didn't advertise. He didn't have a website beyond a single-page listing with a phone number. He charged fairly. He never failed to deliver. The call that changed everything came on a cold Tuesday morning in early November. It didn't come to Marcus first. It came to a man named Thomas Brennan, the chief financial officer of Whitmore Precision Manufacturing, who received it from the plant manager of the company's secondary facility at 6:47 in the morning. The message was direct and alarming. The primary CNC production line had gone down overnight. A cascade fault had propagated through the control board. The entire system was frozen, and the technical team on site had been unable to isolate the source for 4 hours. Whitmore Precision was a metal components manufacturer, the second largest in the southeastern United States by revenue, and the secondary facility was currently under contract to supply a defense subcontractor with a delivery deadline 39 hours away. Thomas Brennan called 2 national maintenance contractors before 8 in the morning and received the same answer from both. They could send a team in 68 hours. He called the original equipment manufacturer's service line and was placed on hold for 11 minutes before being disconnected. He called Jennifer Whitmore's direct line at 8:17 and told her the situation with the careful, verbal framing of a man who had long since learned how to present bad news in the least damaging shape possible. Jennifer listened, said 4 words, "Fix it by noon," and ended the call. Thomas's fourth call was to the plant manager who had originally reported the failure, a man named Walter Grant, who had been running that facility for 19 years and who responded to Thomas's escalating frustration with a flat, measured calm. Walter said he knew one person who might be able to help. He said he couldn't guarantee it. He said the person in question ran a small shop and might not take the call. Thomas said to give him the number anyway. Walter gave it to him and added, before hanging up, that this particular person had once diagnosed a cascade fault in under 3 minutes that a certified systems team had spent 2 days misidentifying. Thomas Brennan wrote the number down, skeptical, and dialed it. Marcus answered on the second ring. He was already at the workbench. The call lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Marcus asked which generation of control board, what the ambient temperature in the facility had been the previous night, and whether the fault codes were showing in sequence or simultaneously. Thomas answered all 3. Marcus was quiet for several seconds after the third answer, the kind of silence that comes from rapid internal calculation rather than uncertainty. Then he said he would come. He asked for the address. He did not ask about the fee, and Thomas, flustered, forgot to mention it. Marcus hung up, set the phone face down on the bench, and began packing his secondary kit with the methodical efficiency of someone who already knew what he was walking into. He left Atlas on the workbench for Amara. He left a note on the door. He drove his 12-year-old Ford pickup across the city and arrived at Whitmore's secondary facility at 9:33. The facility was large, clean, and surrounded by a fleet of leased vehicles that collectively cost more than Marcus's building. A group of people were standing in the parking lot near Tientrins when he pulled in. Jennifer Whitmore among them, a charcoal coat, phone in one hand, the other hand raised to shade her eyes as she assessed the arriving truck. Marcus stepped out. He was wearing dark work pants, a gray button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his older steel-toe boots. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder. He looked at the building first, then at the group. Jennifer Whitmore looked at him the way certain people look at things that arrive in an unexpected package, with a brief, visible recalibration that ends not in openness but in revised condescension. Her assistant, Rachel Moore, stood 2 steps behind her and said nothing. Marcus nodded in the direction of the general group. No one nodded back. He followed Walter Grant inside. What happened in the next 2 hours and 13 minutes was witnessed only by Walter and the 2 floor technicians who had been asked to remain nearby in case Marcus needed assistance. He did not need assistance. He worked through the control cabinet systematically, his movements unhurried, his focus absolute. He did not speak except once, to ask for a specific diagnostic cable that Walter retrieved from a side cabinet. He did not consult documentation, which Walter found remarkable given that the system was a proprietary configuration from nearly a decade earlier. At 11:39, the production line restarted. The cascade fault had been a secondary ground loop failure masking a corrupted initialization sequence, a problem that the original equipment manufacturer's remote diagnostics would likely have taken 3 additional days to correctly identify. Walter stood at the edge of the floor and watched the first components move through the line with the measured satisfaction of a man who had seen a great many things go wrong in this building and not nearly enough go right. Marcus packed his tools. He walked out of the facility and back into the main corridor where Jennifer was waiting with Thomas Brennan and 2 of the operations managers. She was already on her phone again. When Marcus appeared, she ended the call and said with the brisk efficiency of someone settling an invoice, "How much?" Marcus gave her the number. It was a fair rate, not inflated, not discounted. Jennifer didn't look up when she instructed Thomas to process the payment. Thomas, looking at Marcus with the poorly concealed amusement of a man who considers himself to have successfully managed a minor inconvenience, said to the room in general that it was a good thing they had found someone. And wasn't it convenient that the small shop rate was so much easier on the quarterly budget than the contract firms? One of the managers smiled, another looked at the floor. Thomas kept talking, something about operational cost management, and the phrase small operation came out of his mouth twice in 27 seconds. Each time, with the same slight inflection that distinguished it from a neutral description and made it something else entirely. Jennifer did not stop him. She was already scrolling through her phone. Rachel, standing behind Jennifer, looked at the far wall with a careful blankness that Marcus recognized as the expression of someone who was embarrassed by what they were witnessing, but did not have the standing to interrupt it. Marcus did not respond to Thomas. He did not look at Jennifer for a reaction. He zipped his bag closed in the same unhurried way he had opened it and settled the strap on his shoulder. Jennifer looked up briefly and said with a finality that was almost gracious in its efficiency, "Thank you for coming on short notice. If we have smaller issues in the future, we'll be in touch." The word smaller landed in the room and sat there. Marcus looked at her directly for the first time that day, and there was nothing in his expression that she could use. No offense, no anger, no plea for recognition. He looked at her the way a person looks at a system they are studying, noting its properties without judgment. He said it was no problem. Then he walked out. Walter Grant caught up with him near the exit, reached out and shook his hand with both of his own, and said quietly that the control system Marcus had just repaired was originally designed by a Davenport team about 9 years back. Said he had been there when it was installed, and he'd never seen anyone outside the original team work on it without documentation. He said he didn't know if Marcus knew the system from somewhere, but whatever the case, he was grateful. Marcus thanked him without elaborating. He walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine, looking through the windshield at the clean industrial facade of the building that bore the name Whitmore on a brushed steel plate beside the entrance. His face was still. His hands were still. Then he reached into the center console and pulled out a manila folder he had not opened in more than 3 years. It contained a document from his Davenport period, a consulting report he had been commissioned to write on the rehabilitation potential of an older Whitmore facility. He looked at the cover page for a moment, then he put the folder back, started the truck, and drove to pick up Amara. Raymond came over that evening with a six-pack and no particular agenda, which was his way saying, he knew something had happened and he was available if Marcus wanted to talk. They sat at the kitchen table after Amara was in bed, and Marcus laid out the day without editorializing. The visit, the repair, the payment, the comments from Thomas Brennan. Raymond listened to all of it, and then asked the question he had been quietly forming since the first sentence. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus said he was thinking about the Ridgeland facility. Raymond set down his bottle. The Ridgeland facility was the third manufacturing plant in the Whitmore portfolio, a property that Jennifer Whitmore had shuttered 17 months ago on grounds of operational inefficiency. It sat on 14 acres in a neighborhood called Ridgeland, about 7 miles from where they were sitting now. The machinery inside was old. The building itself was mid-century industrial, and the whole property had been carrying a for sale listing for 11 months, with no takers because of its reputation as a money pit. Raymond knew all of this because Marcus had mentioned it once before, months ago, in a context that had not seemed important at the time. Now, hearing Marcus say the name again in that tone, Raymond understood that it had been important all along. What Raymond did not know in that moment, what Marcus told him over the next hour, was the full shape of what existed inside Ridgeland and why the conventional wisdom about it was wrong. Marcus had been inside that facility 6 years earlier during his consulting period when Whitmore's previous management had commissioned a rehabilitation study before Jennifer took over. He had spent 4 days there with a small technical team, and he had written a detailed report concluding that 73% of the installed equipment was recoverable with targeted investment, and that the production capacity, if properly upgraded, would outperform either of Whitmore's active facilities at a significantly lower per-unit cost. That report had been submitted, received, and as Marcus had later learned, forwarded by Jennifer to Thomas Brennan to be handled. It had not been acted on. The facility had been closed instead. Marcus knew the report had gone into a drawer because he had followed up once professionally and received a form response. He had not followed up again, but he had not forgotten what he had seen inside that building. And he had not forgotten the specific equipment configurations, the infrastructure layout, or the particular capabilities that could be unlocked if someone who understood the underlying systems was willing to do the engineering work. Someone who had, as it happened, designed several of the control systems that would integrate with that equipment. Someone who held the patents. Raymond asked one question. He asked how long. Marcus said 16 months from acquisition to first production. Raymond sat with that for a moment, the way a person sits with a number they are checking against their internal confidence register. Then he said he was in. He did not ask about projected returns. He did not ask about risk. He asked when Marcus wanted to start the legal process. Marcus said tomorrow. The legal contact was a property attorney named David Pearson. A careful man with an office that smelled of old books who had handled Marcus's patent agreements during the Davenport years, and who received Marcus's call the following morning with measured surprise. Marcus asked about the current ownership status and listing terms for the Ridgeland property. David said he would look into it and call back by end of day. He called back in 3 hours and 52 minutes. The asking price was lower than Marcus had expected, not dramatically lower, but low enough that the number felt like a door being held open. The property had been sitting long enough that Whitmore's board had apparently authorized Thomas Brennan to accept any reasonable offer rather than continue carrying the asset on a balance sheet that was already drawing attention heading into the annual audit. David said there was no indication that the seller was scrutinizing buyers beyond standard financial qualification. Marcus said to draft the offer. He sat with the numbers that evening and ran them 4 times. Not because he doubted his engineering estimate, but because discipline required it. The capital Raymond was committing covered acquisition, initial rehabilitation, and 13 months of operating runway before the first production revenue arrived. It was tight. It was not impossible. Marcus had worked with tighter tolerances than that for most of his career, and the principle was the same. Precision mattered more than margin, and patience mattered more than speed. He drove to Ridgeland on a Thursday afternoon, while Amara was at school, arriving in a light drizzle that turned the old building's brick exterior a deep rust color. The facility had been locked and dark for more than a year, and the loading bay doors wore chains with padlocks. But Marcus had arranged temporary access through David's office. He walked through the entire floor space over the course of 5 hours, moving through each section with the slow attention of someone reading a language they knew fluently. He checked structural connections, examined motor housings, assessed conduit runs, tested manual overrides on the equipment where they existed. He did not take notes because he did not need to. Everything he needed was already organized in his memory, in the way that certain minds organize things they have decided to care about permanently. By the time he walked back out into the drizzle, he had revised his 16-month estimate down to 14. The building had aged well in the ways that mattered, and poorly in the ways that were correctable. The purchase closed on a quiet Friday morning. No press release, no announcement. The acquiring entity was Eastfield Industrial Holdings, a company that had been registered 4 weeks prior, with Raymond as co-owner and Marcus as managing director. The filing was public record, available to anyone who searched for it, but no one who worked at Whitmore Precision had reason to search for it, and the name Callaway, appearing in a routine commercial property transaction, carried no flag. Thomas Brennan signed the transfer documentation during a meeting he had scheduled for 27 minutes and which he spent largely reviewing his phone. The former Whitmore employees, who had been laid off when Ridgeland closed, were not informed of the sale, though several of them would learn of it soon enough, through channels that did not require an announcement. In the weeks after the acquisition, Marcus worked quietly through the hiring process, reaching out through Walter Grant's network and through former Davenport contacts to find people with the specific skills the Ridgeland operation would need. He did not post listings publicly. He called people directly, explained the project plainly, and offered a wage that was fair without being extraordinary. What drew people in was not the money but the nature of the offer itself. A chance to work on something being built from the ground up by someone who knew exactly what he was building and why. Among the first 17 hires were 7 former Ridgeland employees who had been cut when Jennifer closed the facility. They knew the building, they knew the equipment. They showed up on the first day of interior work with a focused energy that Marcus recognized and respected. He did not give a speech. He showed them what they were going to build, answered their questions directly, and then they began. There was a particular satisfaction in watching those 7 people walk back through a door that had been closed on them, carrying tool bags and wearing the same work boots they had worn before the layoff, returning not with bitterness but with the specific determination of workers who understood the value of what they were being given. Marcus registered that satisfaction and set it aside. There was too much work ahead for sentiment to occupy much space. While Marcus built, Whitmore Precision entered a period of compounding friction that its leadership was slow to accurately diagnose. A defense subcontract that had been expected to renew did not renew, the contracting agency citing concerns about delivery reliability in their evaluation notes. A second client reduced its order volume without formal explanation. Jennifer received these signals through Thomas Brennan's reporting, which framed each setback as an isolated market fluctuation rather than a systemic pattern. The quality control issues that were generating the underlying client dissatisfaction had been accumulating across Whitmore's active facilities for nearly 3 years, the result of deferred maintenance and staffing reductions that had followed Jennifer's restructuring program. The program had improved short-term margins and damaged long-term capability, a trade-off that was common and that experienced operations people recognized immediately. Jennifer was experienced in capital strategy and market positioning. She was less experienced in the floor-level mechanics of production quality. And the people around her who understood those mechanics had been filtered out through several rounds of performance review that rewarded financial fluency over operational knowledge. Rachel Moore was one of the people who understood something was wrong before it appeared in the numbers. She had been Jennifer's executive assistant for 5 years, a role that gave her access to correspondence, meeting summaries, and client communications that presented the full picture rather than the curated version that moved up the reporting chain. She had written a memo 11 months earlier, carefully worded, outlining the pattern she was seeing in client feedback and maintenance request frequency. Jennifer had read it, marked it, and forwarded it to Thomas with instructions to review. Rachel had not received a response and had not been invited to discuss it further. She had continued doing her job and watching. It was during this period of watching that she first noticed the Eastfield Industrial name in a transaction summary she processed as part of the routine paperwork that crossed her desk. The name meant nothing to her in that moment. She logged it and moved on. The Eastfield Industrial operation at Ridgeland reached what Marcus called first production, meaning the line was running clean at sustainable volume, in the 13th month after acquisition, 1 month ahead of schedule. The initial product was a category of precision-machined aerospace component that fell within a specification range that very few North American manufacturers could reliably meet. Marcus had designed the production process to hit that specification consistently using a control system integration that reflected both his engineering background and the specific capabilities of the Ridgeland equipment, updated and modified by his own hand. The tolerance margin on the first production run was 17% tighter than the published industry standard. Raymond, who was present for the first full shift, said nothing for a long time after reviewing the quality report. Then he said that they were going to have more work than they could schedule within 7 months. Marcus said he knew. The first commercial contract came from a mid-tier defense subcontractor that had, 17 months earlier, been a Whitmore Precision client. They had left Whitmore after the delivery failure and spent the intervening period working with a less capable supplier, while quietly monitoring the market for something better. They received a brief technical summary about Eastfield Industrial through a mutual contact in the industry, ordered a small evaluation batch, and received it on the scheduled date with documentation that exceeded their internal quality benchmarks. They sent a contract inquiry the following week. Marcus's legal team reviewed it, made 3 adjustments, and returned it signed. The relationship was not announced. In the world of precision manufacturing, the deals that mattered most were almost never announced. By the 15th month, Eastfield Industrial had 4 active production contracts and a 5th under negotiation with a German automotive supplier that had been searching for a North American partner capable of meeting their exacting dimensional standards. The conversation with the German team had been initiated through an intermediary and conducted with the measured patience of 2 parties who both understood that the right agreement was worth waiting for. When the contract was finalized, the annual value was larger than Whitmore Precision's total revenue from the previous quarter. The news appeared in a trade publication, briefly, in a single paragraph that named Eastfield Industrial, and described it as an emerging precision components manufacturer based in Ridgeland. There was no photograph of Marcus Calloway. There was no background on the company's founding. There was only the name, the location, and the number. Thomas Brennan read the paragraph at his desk and felt the temperature of the room change around him, in a way that had nothing to do with the climate control system. He did a transaction search on Eastfield Industrial Holdings and found the property record for the Ridgeland acquisition. He sat with that for a long time. He ran the numbers on what Ridgeland's current production capacity was likely to be based on the known equipment configuration, and the reasonable assumptions about what a competent operator could achieve with proper investment. The result sat in his chest like a stone. The price he had accepted for the property, the price he had been authorized to accept, yes, but it also advised was reasonable, represented a fraction of what the asset was now generating. He closed the browser and did not open it again that day. He did not bring it to Jennifer's attention. Rachel Moore, working separately and more carefully, traced the same path and arrived at a different response. She searched the Eastfield Industrial name in combination with the Ridgeland facility and the known transaction date. She found the public filing and Marcus Calloway's name as managing director. She sat with that for a moment, then typed his name into a separate search, adding the word Davenport. The results that came back were not surprising in the way unexpected information surprises. They were surprising in the way that something you should have known all along surprises, the lurch of recognition that arrives a beat too late. 7 patents. 13 years of systems engineering at a firm whose clients included, among many others, Whitmore Precision. She printed the relevant pages, collated them with the Ridgeland transaction record, and placed them in a folder on her desk. She sat looking at that folder for a while before she picked up her pen and wrote Marcus Calloway's name on the tab in her neat, unhurried hand. She did not go to Thomas. She understood, with the clarity that comes from 5 years of watching what happened to information that went through Thomas before it reached Jennifer, that this particular folder needed to travel a different route. She waited for the right moment to take it to Jennifer directly. That moment came on a Thursday evening when the 2 of them were working late. As they often did at the end of the quarter, Jennifer reviewing reports at the conference table, Rachel handling correspondence nearby. Rachel placed the folder on the table beside Jennifer's water glass without comment. Jennifer looked at her, then down at the folder, then opened it. She read the first page slowly, then the second, then the patent list. She went back to the photograph on the first page, a professional headshot from a Davenport profile that was 7 years old, showing a man in a dark jacket looking directly into the camera with the composed, unguarded expression of someone who had nothing to perform. Jennifer recognized the face. She recognized the posture. She recognized the exact quality of stillness. The man who had walked into her facility carrying a worn tool bag. The man whose work had restarted a production line she had been told could not be restarted. The man she had thanked for handling a small matter. She closed the folder and held very still for a moment. Then she asked Rachel how long ago the Ridgeland acquisition had closed. Rachel told her. Jennifer did not say anything more that evening. The audit that followed was Jennifer's decision, made without announcement and framed to the board as a routine operational review. Rachel was assigned to support the audit team, which meant she had access to the full documentation trail around Thomas Brennan's management of the Ridgeland disposition process. The trail was not clean. The property valuation Thomas had accepted and recommended to the board had not been supported by an independent assessment. The risk flags in the due diligence file were sparse in a way that suggested they had not been fully completed. And there was a section of the file related to the buyer's background where the verification field was blank. It was a procedural failure, compounded by a reporting failure, the second being worse than the first, because it had been ongoing and deliberate. The audit team presented their findings in a document that was thorough and in its thoroughness unambiguous. Thomas Brennan submitted his resignation 7 days before the findings were formally presented to the board. He submitted it quietly, by email, with a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities. Jennifer accepted it without response. She sat alone in the conference room after the last board member filed out. The window on the far wall looked west toward Ridgeland, though the building itself was not visible from this distance. She pulled the folder Rachel had given her out of her briefcase and set it on the table again. She had read it 5 more times since that Thursday evening, not because she was learning new information, but because she was doing something harder, which was revising the story she had told herself about the man whose shop she had dismissed, whose fee she had processed without looking up, whose capability she had summarized in the word small and not thought about again until a trade publication forced her to. She found Marcus Calloway's phone number through David Pearson's office, which took 1 call and no particular difficulty, because Marcus had not hidden himself. He had simply never been asked. He answered on the 3rd ring. She said her name. There was a pause that was not awkward, only genuine, the pause of a person who is deciding how to respond rather than whether to respond. He said, "Hello." She said she would like to meet and discuss a potential supply arrangement. He said he was available Tuesday morning. She asked where would work for him. He said, the shop on Eastway Drive. She said she would be there at 9. She arrived alone, no assistant, no driver, no documents under her arm. She had not been in the shop before. She had stood at the entrance that first day and not come in. Inside, she saw it differently than she would have seen it that day. The ordered tools, the clean benches, the framed photograph on the back wall of a group of engineers in front of a completed production facility. Marcus younger by a decade and standing second from the left, and on the corner of the main workbench, a small brown stuffed bear with button eyes and one ear slightly more worn than the other. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. There was something disorienting about standing in this room after standing in her own offices for so long. Something about the scale and the material honesty of the space that made the language she normally relied on feel poorly fitted to the occasion. Marcus came through the back door with 2 mugs of coffee, set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and sat on the stool across the bench. She wrapped her hands around the mug and said what she had come to say first. That she had reviewed his background and understood now who she had been working with. And that she wanted to discuss a long-term supply agreement for precision components. Marcus listened to the full shape of her proposal. Then he said that he appreciated her directness. Then he said one other thing, not sharply, not as an accusation, but as a plain statement. "Do you remember that afternoon at your facility?" She looked at him. He said he didn't need anything from her about it. He said that what happened that day was what it was, and he hadn't lost sleep over it. But he wanted her to understand that the shop was real, and the work was real, and he had never been ashamed of either. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not offer the easy apology that would have ended the moment quickly. She said she understood that now. It was not the same thing as an apology, and they both knew it. But it was something more specific than an apology, which was an honest acknowledgement made directly to the person it was owed to. She pushed a folder across the bench. He looked at the cover, did not open it. She said, "Take whatever time you need to review the terms." He said he would. She stood to go, picking up her coat from the second stool where she had draped it. At the door, she turned and looked at the sign above the entrance, the hand-lettered name that she had passed once without reading, and that she read now as information, plain and accurate. The name of the man and the place where he worked, neither more nor less than that. Raymond stopped by the shop that evening and found Marcus at the bench with the folder open, reading through the supply agreement terms with the deliberate care he brought to any document that carried consequences. Raymond set a coffee on the corner of the bench beside Atlas and asked what he was looking at. Marcus said, "Whitmore wants a supply arrangement." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Are you going to do it?" Marcus said he was thinking about it. Raymond said, "4 months ago that would have been a strange thing for you to say." Marcus turned the page and said, "4 months ago I wasn't ready to ask whether she was worth working with. Now I am. That's different." Raymond picked up his coffee and said nothing more, which was his way of indicating that he understood the distinction completely. 4 weeks later, Marcus signed the agreement. Not because he needed the contract. Eastfield Industrial had enough work to sustain itself and grow on its own terms. He signed it because the terms were fair and the product would be used well. And because, as he told David Pearson when they reviewed the final document together, good work ought to go where it can do the most. David had looked at him over his reading glasses and said that was an unusual reason for a business decision. Marcus said he had made unusual decisions before, and most of them had worked out. The fallout for Jennifer Whitmore came not from Marcus, not from Raymond, and not from the Eastfield operation, but from the internal audit findings that made their way, as such findings always do, into the hands of board members who had questions. Those questions led to more questions. The board's relationship with Jennifer had been strained for months by the contract losses and the deferred maintenance issues. The revelation that the Ridgeland facility, a property they had written off as a loss, was now generating more revenue under a competitor's management than their own active facilities, using equipment and systems they had abandoned, was the final calculation that moved the board from concern to action. Jennifer Whitmore was removed from her position as CEO in a closed board meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. The press release went out 3 hours later. It cited a mutual decision to pursue new strategic directions. No one believed it. Thomas Brennan, who had already resigned, found himself unemployable in the manufacturing sector within a matter of weeks. The audit findings were not made public, but they were known. And in industries where trust and competence are the primary currencies, known is enough. His phone stopped ringing. His emails went unreturned. He moved to a smaller city in Tennessee, where his name did not precede him, and took a job managing logistics for a trucking company at a salary that was less than half of what he had earned at Whitmore. Jennifer did not move. She stayed in Charlotte, but she stopped appearing at the professional events and conferences that had once filled her calendar. She declined interviews. She did not issue statements. She sat in her house and understood, with a clarity that came too late to change anything, that the person she had dismissed as small had been the only person in the room that day who had seen the situation clearly. She had looked at Marcus Calloway and seen his clothes, his truck, his tool bag. She had not looked at his work. The mistake was not the dismissal. The mistake was the assumption that followed the dismissal, the assumption that what she could not immediately see did not exist. And in the world where Jennifer had built her career, that kind of mistake was the only one that mattered. 6 months after the board meeting, a reporter from a local business publication reached out to Jennifer for a comment on the Eastfield Industrial story, which by then had been covered in several trade journals as an example of successful industrial rehabilitation. Jennifer declined the interview, but issued a brief written statement. The statement said that business decisions are made with the information available at the time, and that hindsight is a luxury that operating executives do not have. It was a careful statement, written by someone who had been trained to say the right things, but it was also a statement that carried no acknowledgement of the human being, who had been standing in her facility that day, and who she had thanked for handling something small. The statement was published. It was read. It changed nothing. The sign outside Marcus's shop came down on a Saturday morning. Marcus did it himself, up on a ladder with a socket set, unbolting the old bracket from the fascia board while Amara stood below in her jacket, holding Atlas and watching. When the old sign was off, she asked what the new one was going to say. Marcus climbed down and stood beside her, looking at the clean rectangle of exposed brick where the old sign had been. He said, "Just Calloway." Amara thought about that and nodded with the grave consideration that 10-year-olds apply to decisions they have been included in. The new sign went up that afternoon, clean and flat and simple. One word in dark letters, no descriptor, no qualifier. The name had always been enough. It had just taken the world a while to read it correctly. In the kind of city where people move fast and judge by surface, the story of Marcus Calloway was not a story that would ever be told loudly. No feature article, no profile photograph, no origin narrative republished on the platforms where such stories were usually performed. The trade publications mentioned Eastfield Industrial occasionally, when a contract was significant enough to note. The number of people who knew the full arc of what had happened could have fit in the front room of the shop. But in the world where precision and patience, and the willingness to work, without an audience, determined what lasted, Marcus Calloway had built something that would still be running long after the names on the Whitmore letterhead had changed several times over. He had done it without announcement and without revenge, because those were not the tools he worked with. He had done it the same way he fixed the machine that day. Quietly, correctly, completely. And when the work was finished, he turned off the light and went home to his daughter. Amara sat at the kitchen table that evening, working on a school project, a poster about people who inspire her. She had drawn Marcus in the center, standing at his workbench with a wrench in one hand. Above his head, in careful block letters, she had written, "My dad builds things that last." Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at the poster for a long time. He did not say anything. He walked over and kissed the top of her head and went to the stove to start dinner. Outside, the light was fading. The street lights on Eastway Drive came on one by one, marking the boundary between the workday and whatever came after. Marcus moved through the familiar motions of cooking, the same motions he had performed 1,000 times before, in the same kitchen, for the same person. And there was something deeply satisfying about that. Something that no contract, no facility, no validation from people who had once dismissed him could ever replace. The simple, unhurried knowledge that the person who mattered most felt safe when he was in the room. Everything else was just noise. 3 months after the supply agreement was signed, Marcus received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single page, typed, unsigned. It read, "I was one of the managers in the corridor that day. I didn't say anything when Thomas made those comments. I should have. I want you to know that what you built at Ridgeland is the best work I've seen in 20 years in this industry. And I'm sorry it took so long for people to see it. You deserved better." Marcus read the letter once, folded it, and placed it in the folder with the Ridgeland Consulting report. He did not try to identify who sent it. The apology was not the point. The point was that someone had been standing in that corridor who understood what had happened, and who had carried it with them long enough to write it down. That was enough. Marcus filed the folder back in the cabinet and returned to the workbench. There was a motor housing that needed inspection, and the client had asked for it by Thursday. He opened his toolkit and began. Raymond called that afternoon to tell him that a 5th contract had closed, this one with a Canadian aerospace firm, and that the projected revenue for the next fiscal year was going to exceed their original 5-year plan. Marcus listened, said that was good news, and asked if Raymond wanted to come over for dinner. Raymond laughed and said he would bring the beer. They sat on the back porch that evening while Amara played in the yard, and Raymond asked Marcus if he ever thought about what would have happened if Jennifer had treated him differently that day. If she had looked up from her phone, if Thomas had kept his comments to himself, if the word small had never been said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think about it sometimes." "But not the way you're asking." Raymond waited. "I think about the fact that if she had seen me that day, really seen me, I might have fixed her machine and left. I might have gone back to the shop and kept doing what I was doing, and Ridgeland would still be sitting there empty." He looked out at the yard, at Amara running in circles with Atlas held above her head like a trophy. So in a way, her not seeing me was the best thing that could have happened. Because it reminded me that I didn't need to be seen by people like her to build something worth building. Raymond thought about that. Then he said, "That's a hell of a way to look at it." Marcus smiled. "It's the only way that lets me sleep at night." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from years of friendship and the shared understanding that some conversations don't need conclusions, they just need space. When Raymond left, Marcus stayed on the porch. The evening was cool. The marigolds in the planter box were starting to bloom, small orange heads pushing up through the mulch. Amara came and sat beside him, leaning her head against his arm. She didn't say anything, neither did he. They just sat there together, watching the light fade, and Marcus thought about the fact that the most valuable thing a person can build in their life is not a fortune or a reputation. It's the knowledge that the people they love feel safe when they're in the room. Everything else is decoration. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who see the clearest. Sometimes the person everyone underestimated turns out to be the one who was holding everything together all along. Jennifer Whitmore never publicly apologized. Thomas Brennan never admitted he was wrong. But the 7 former Ridgeland employees who walked back through that door, who rebuilt a facility that had been abandoned, who worked for a man who saw their value when no one else did, they knew. They knew that dignity doesn't come from titles or corner offices or the approval of people who measure worth in quarterly earnings. Dignity comes from showing up, doing the work, and treating people like they matter. Even when no one else is watching. Especially when no one else is watching. Marcus Calloway understood that better than anyone, and in the end, that understanding was the only thing that mattered. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the people you've dismissed too quickly, or the times when someone saw you when others didn't, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.